You're watching a 22-year-old college student walk up to the gate of the Russian consulate in San Francisco. He is carrying 3 pieces of paper. His name is Nathaniel Nicholson. He's a former paratrooper with 2 fractured bones above his tailbone and shins the Army has written off. He takes classes at a community college in Eugene, Oregon, and he wants to be an architect. He has never done anything like this in his life, and if somebody stops him at that gate, he has a cover story ready. He'll say he came to ask the Russians about architecture. The 3 pieces of paper are these: a letter introducing himself, a photograph of a man and a young man taken inside a federal prison, and a request for money. The man in the photograph is his father. His father is Harold James Nicholson, and he is, to this day, the highest-ranking CIA officer ever convicted of spying for Russia. He has been behind bars since November of 1996. He is serving 283 months. And for the past several months, in a prison visiting room 90 minutes from that community college, he has been teaching his youngest son how to spot surveillance, how to move cash without leaving a trail, and how to walk into a Russian consulate. Over the next 2 years, Nathan will fly to Mexico City, to Lima, Peru, to Nicosia, Cyprus. He will collect roughly $47,000 in $100 bills from officers of Russian intelligence, hide it in pieces around Oregon, and hand it out to his grandparents, his brother, and his sister, telling them it came from the family craft business. None of that has happened yet. Right now, he's a kid at a gate with 3 sheets of paper in his hand, and a Russian official is walking toward him. We're going to come back to that gate, because the strangest thing about this story is not that a father used his son. It's that the United States government had already caught this man once, taken him apart, photographed him committing the crime, put him in a cell, and closed the file with a bow on it. To understand how a convicted spy came to be running an intelligence operation out of a federal prison in Oregon and how he talked his own child into being the wire, you have to go back to a fencing class at Oregon State University. Harold James Nicholson was born on the 17th of November, 1950 in Woodburn, Oregon. Everyone called him Jim. His father was an Air Force officer, which meant Jim's childhood was a list of places rather than a place. Bases in Kentucky, in California, on Okinawa. He learned young how to be the new boy in a room. He learned how to be liked quickly and known slowly. At Oregon State, he took a fencing class, and in that class, he saw a woman named Laura Sue Cooper. Everyone called her Lori. According to her own account years later, Jim bet his roommate he could get a date with her. He won the bet. He proposed 5 days after the first date. They married 4 months after that, in 1973. That is the first thing worth writing down about Jim Nicholson. He decided fast, and he did not renegotiate. He was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant the same year and served as an Army captain in an intelligence unit of the 101st Airborne Division. In October of 1980, he joined the Central Intelligence Agency. They sent him to Camp Peary, Virginia, the training facility every officer just calls the farm. Then the postings: Manila, 1982 to 1985, Bangkok, 1985 to 1987, Tokyo, 1987 to 1989, and in 1990, at 39 years old, Jim Nicholson became Chief of Station in Bucharest, the CIA's top officer in Romania, in the raw, violent months after Nicolae Ceausescu was dragged out and shot. Inside the building, he was fast-track material. Colleagues gave him a call sign, and the call sign was Batman. Remember that. It matters later, and not in a way anybody laughed about. Now, the other column of the ledger. In 23 years of marriage, the Nicholson family moved 21 times. 21. His children were dragged from one country to the next, out of one school and into another, and their father was very often not there. He skipped family vacations. He traveled. He worked. Lori later put it plainly to a reporter. None of the 3 kids enjoyed being hauled around the world. And in Bucharest, something in him turned strange. Jim told his wife he had a file on her 1.5 inches thick. He accused her, his own wife, in the middle of a hostile, foreign posting of passing intelligence to the Romanians. Years afterward, when it was all over, she said this: "One thing I've learned in life is that when people accuse you of something, maybe they're thinking about it themselves." She went back to Oregon and filed for divorce in 1992. It was finalized in 1994. And here is the detail that changes the shape of everything that follows. The court gave Jim custody of all 3 children. A court-appointed guardian concluded that the mother's continuing anger toward her husband was hurting the kids. So the traitor-to-be got the children. Jeremy, the eldest, Star, the daughter, and Nathan, the youngest, who was 10 years old. The other thing Lori mentioned, almost in passing, was money. He liked to spend it. He complained constantly that he never had enough of it. He was about to solve that problem in the worst way a CIA officer can. From 1992 to 1994, Jim Nicholson was deputy chief of station in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. His wife was gone. His marriage was in a courtroom on the other side of the planet. He had a Thai girlfriend he reportedly wanted to marry. He was, in the flat language of the counterintelligence textbooks he had been trained on, a man in personal and financial distress with access to secrets. And here is the part that reads like a bad joke that nobody in Langley wanted to say out loud. Part of his job in Kuala Lumpur was to meet Russian intelligence officers and try to recruit them. CIA records show that in his final months in Malaysia, Nicholson met with one officer of the SVR, Russia's post-Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, on 4 separate occasions. 3 of those meetings happened inside the Russian embassy in Kuala Lumpur. All 3 were authorized by the CIA in advance, and all 3 were reported by Nicholson afterward, written up properly, filed properly. A case officer doing his job. The 4th meeting was not authorized, and it was not reported. Investigators believe that is the meeting where it flipped, where the man sent to recruit a Russian sat down and let the Russian recruit him instead. That is the entire mechanism of this case, and it is worth understanding once, because everything else in the next 14 years is just this one arrangement being maintained. A serving CIA officer meeting his handlers in Asian cities on ordinary vacation trips, photographing documents at his own desk, and being paid in cash and wire transfers that arrived a day or 2 after each contact. We know the date of the last reported meeting, the 29th of June, 1994. We know what happened the next day, because the FBI eventually pulled every bank record he had. On the 30th of June, 1994, $12,000 was wired into Jim Nicholson's savings account at the Selco Credit Union in Eugene, Oregon. The FBI was never able to trace that money to any legitimate source of income, not once, in 4 years of trying. $12,000 is not a fortune. It is also not the point. The point is what he did next. Because when his Malaysia tour ended, Jim Nicholson came home to Virginia and took a job that made him, for the purposes of a Russian intelligence service, worth far more than a station chief. He became a teacher. From 1994 until July of 1996, Harold James Nicholson was a staff instructor at the CIA's Special Training Center. He taught tradecraft. He taught young men and women how to run agents, how to spot a tail, how to service a dead drop, how to live a second life without their neighbors ever noticing. And in that job, he had access to something the SVR could not have bought at any price from any station chief anywhere in the world. The biographical information and the onward assignments for every single CIA case officer trained during his 2-year tenure. Every one. Their real names, their covers, where they were going next. He sold the classes of 1994, 1995, and 1996. He sold his own students. Understand what that means as an engineering problem. A case officer's entire professional value is that nobody knows who they are. The agency spends years and millions of dollars building a person who can walk into a foreign capital and be nobody in particular. Nicholson handed a hostile service a roster. The Diamond assessment concluded that it would be difficult, in some cases impossible, for the CIA to ever place some of those newly trained officers in sensitive foreign postings for the rest of their careers. Kids in their 20s who had just finished the hardest training the United States offers, whose futures were deleted before they started by the man standing at the front of the classroom. He also sold the identity of the CIA's chief of station in Moscow and the Moscow station's staffing, the identities and code names of informants, Russian recruitment approaches made against CIA officers, intelligence reporting on Chechnya, reporting from an access agent on Russian military and technology purchases, and, in a detail that ought to be studied in every intelligence school on Earth, he sold the debriefing summary of Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer arrested for spying for Moscow in 1994. The summary of what Ames had confessed. Nicholson reportedly said afterward that the Ames case had not deterred him at all. It had inspired him. Now, here's what the arrangement actually looked like from the outside if you were an accountant. Twice a year, roughly, Jim Nicholson took a trip to Asia. A holiday, perfectly ordinary. And every single time, when he came back, money appeared. December 1994, a $9,000 wire from Malaysia, plus $6,000 paid to American Express. On his return, he settled debts of $13,019.35, and he paid with $131 bills. June and July of 1995, after travel to Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, $23,815.21 deposited across several accounts. December 1995 into January 1996, around a trip to Bangkok and Phuket, roughly $26,900. June 1996, Singapore, about $20,000 in transactions, including $8,300 in cash handed to American Express. Over the whole run, he took in around $300,000. About $120,000 of it landed in bank deposits nobody could explain. His CIA salary was $73,000 a year. And that Singapore trip in June of 1996, the 26th to the 28th, is the one worth looking at closely, because by then somebody was already watching him do it. Surveillance recorded a serving CIA officer running counter-surveillance maneuvers on the streets of Singapore, doubling back, checking, doing the drills he had been taught by the United States and had spent 2 years teaching to other people. And then, at the end of the drills, making contact with a Russian diplomatic vehicle. He was good at it. He was so good at it that he never once noticed the people behind him were American. Everything up to this point had been the easy part for him. He had a system, and the system was working. And the only real risk in his life was a routine test he had passed comfortably for 16 years. In 1995, according to accounts of the investigation, the FBI received a tip from a Russian source. There was another mole inside the CIA. Not Ames, somebody else. And the profile that came with the tip fit Jim Nicholson. That autumn, Nicholson sat down for what he believed was an ordinary 5-year security update, a polygraph. He had taken them before. He was an instructor in deception. On the 16th and again on the 20th of October, 1995, the machine and the scorers came back with a number that examiners almost never see. On the questions about contact with a foreign intelligence service, questions as blunt as, "Have you had unauthorized contact with a foreign intelligence service?" The analysis gave a 0.97 probability of deception, 97%. One further answer was flagged inconclusive. They tested him again on the 4th of December, 1995, 0.88 probability of deception. And this time, the examiner wrote something down that no amount of lawyering ever explained away. The subject appeared to be manipulating the test through controlled breathing. He was trying to beat the box. And the man watching him could see him trying. So the CIA had a senior operations officer who registered 97% deceptive on the question of whether he was working for a foreign service, who then attempted to game a second test. They did not arrest him. They promoted him. In July of 1996, Harold James Nicholson was moved to CIA headquarters at Langley and made a branch chief in the Counterterrorism Center, GS-15. A corner of the building where American operations against terrorist groups were planned. That was not a failure of judgment. That was the trap. Because there was a man already waiting for him inside it. His name was John McGuire. He was a CIA officer and a former Baltimore police officer who had built a career in counterterrorism. And one day, he was called in by Ed Curran, the senior FBI official embedded at CIA, and offered a job in the following terms. I have an assignment that you've been selected for. I can't tell you what it is. Take it without knowing what it is, or decline it and never find out. McGuire took it. He was polygraphed himself at a safe house on questions about Russia, not because anyone doubted him, but because you do not put an unverified man next to a suspected traitor. Then he was given his actual task: get Jim Nicholson to hire you, not to arrest him, not to watch him from a van, to become his deputy, to sit outside his office, carry his files, drink with him, work for him, and report every movement he made to the FBI. He pulled it off. Nicholson picked John McGuire as his own deputy branch chief. Reportedly, it was the first time in the CIA's history that a spy was used to catch a spy inside Langley itself. McGuire later described the job as a methodical mind game of four-dimensional chess, an operational meeting that ran 8 to 9 hours a day, every day, with no allowance for a single mistake. He described his boss in two phrases that tell you everything about how hard it was. Nicholson was smooth, very, very crafty, and Nicholson was a mercenary son of a bitch. The evidence McGuire physically collected was not glamorous. It was a cop's work. He got hold of Nicholson's coffee cup so the bureau would have his DNA. He borrowed Nicholson's car keys, an ordinary favor between colleagues, the kind nobody remembers by lunchtime, long enough for impressions to be taken so that the FBI could let itself into the man's house. Everything you have heard so far, the recruitment, the classes he sold, the money, the polygraphs, was the part the government could reconstruct afterward from paper. What comes next is the part they had to catch him doing in real time, with weeks to work in, against a man who taught this for a living. And the thing that finally destroyed Harold Nicholson was not a wire transfer or a lie detector. It was a postage stamp. McGuire noticed something so small it should have meant nothing. His boss went to a post office and bought international postage stamps. A case officer buying foreign stamps is a man writing to somebody abroad. The FBI put resources on his mail. Late one night, having left his children at home, Jim Nicholson drove out and mailed something. On the 1st of August, 1996, a postcard went out to an accommodation address overseas, signed with a name that does not exist: Neville R. Strachey. The FBI intercepted it, photographed it, and put it back into the postal system so that it would arrive on time. Here is what the postcard said: I will not be your neighbor as expected. Priorities at the Home Office resulted in my assignment to the management position there. Read that again as a Russian handler would read it. He is apologizing. His service had expected him to end up somewhere near them, and instead, he'd been handed a desk job at headquarters. He is reporting to his employers on his failure to be more useful. On the 9th of October, 1996, a second postcard went out with identical stamps. I hope it is possible that you will be my guest for a ski holiday this year on 23rd to 24th November. There was no ski holiday. There was a meeting in Europe on a date that the FBI now had in writing weeks in advance. And per McGuire's account, the stamp he had licked to seal that first postcard carried his own DNA, a physical thread running from a CIA officer's tongue to a Russian intelligence address. From there, it collapsed quickly. On the 23rd of September, 1996, he was observed removing a camera from his desk and holding it above papers on his lap, as if trying to photograph documents. Around the 3rd of November, a court-authorized search of his office turned up roughly 40 classified documents concerning Russian military preparedness and Russian intelligence capabilities. Then, on the 12th of November, 1996, Jim Nicholson asked the agency for a document camera. He was given one, issued, cheerfully, by the CIA's own technical office. He carried it into his office and shut the door. He put the camera under his desk, and for about 30 minutes, he photographed secret documents out of a black folder, cutting the classification markings off first so that the negatives would look like nothing in particular. He did it again that evening. He did it again on the 13th. A concealed camera filmed all of it. The agency had wired his office. He was photographing documents on his lap while being photographed doing it. On the 16th of November, 1996, Harold James Nicholson arrived at Washington Dulles International Airport to board a flight to Zurich on his way to a ski holiday on the 23rd and 24th. Two CIA colleagues were traveling with him. They knew nothing. They were quietly diverted. Nicholson was carrying 10 rolls of exposed film, a classified computer disk, and a laptop holding top-secret reporting on CIA operations inside Russia. The FBI took him at the airport. John McGuire was watching. Years later, he described it in one sentence. "I watched his life evaporate in front of his eyes when he got the handcuffs on him." It was the day before his 46th birthday. At a home in Burke, Virginia, 3 children whose father had custody of them were waiting for him to come back from a trip. 2 days later, the CIA and the FBI did something they had almost never done. They held a joint press conference and stood together at the same microphones. The Director of Central Intelligence, John Deutsch, called the arrest the direct result of an unprecedented level of cooperation between the CIA and the FBI. The Director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, said the most formidable weapon against espionage was exactly that partnership. Then Deutsch was asked whether this was the end of it, and he answered with a sentence that should have unsettled everyone in the room. "There will be other cases that involve the CIA. There will be other cases that involve other security agencies." He was asked whether Nicholson had help. "We have no reason to believe he wasn't acting alone." That answer was true in 1996. It would stop being true in 2006, and the accomplice would be the 12-year-old boy who was, at that moment, at home in Burke, Virginia, wondering where his dad was. Nicholson was charged under Title 18, Section 794 of the United States Code. On paper, it carried life without parole. On paper, it carried the death penalty. Behind the scenes, the agency was doing arithmetic of a different kind. Officers had to be pulled. Assignments had to be canceled. Informants had to be assessed for whether they were still alive. The classes of 1994, 1995, and 1996 had to be told, one by one, that their instructor had sold their names, and that certain countries were now closed to them permanently. The rest, on paper, is tidy. In February of 1997, he signed a plea agreement in the Eastern District of Virginia. On the 5th of June, 1997, United States District Judge James C. Kacharis sentenced him to 283 months, 23 years and 7 months, the maximum the deal allowed. He apologized in court. The Director of Central Intelligence and the Director of the FBI stood side by side and called the case a triumph of cooperation between two agencies that had spent decades not cooperating. And if this were a film, that is where it would end. The traitor is unmasked by a cop with a coffee cup. The identities are burned, but the bleeding stops. The highest-ranking CIA officer ever convicted of espionage goes into a cell. The case is closed, and the credits roll over a shot of the Langley seal. That is not what happened. Because of where they sent him. They sent Harold Nicholson to the Federal Correctional Institution at Sheridan, Oregon, a medium-security prison. And they did it deliberately, as a humane gesture. His 3 children had gone to live with his own parents in Eugene, Oregon, and Sheridan put him within driving distance of them. Years later, an FBI special agent in charge described that decision in one dry sentence. He was allowed to serve time in a federal prison in Oregon to be near his family. In February of 2002, a concerned citizen, by press accounts, a fellow inmate serving time for bank robbery, told the FBI that Harold Nicholson was trying to get a message out to his old Russian handlers through other prisoners. The FBI opened a file. They could not prove it. So they waited. They waited 6 years. Now, the son. Nathan Nicholson was 12 when his father was convicted. He had learned at about 10 that his dad worked for the CIA. At the time, the family was living at the training camp near Williamsburg, Virginia, in a 2-story government house, and Nathan was a boy who rarely saw his father and absorbed his father's stories instead. The stories were good. That was the problem. His father was Batman, and by the accounts of people who later spent years with Nathan, the boy visiting that prison came to think of himself as Robin. Everything after the arrest was smaller. He and his brother and sister moved into their grandparents' house in Eugene. He grew up as the son of a famous traitor in a town where everybody knew. He tried to fix it the way a young man fixes things. He joined the United States Army and went out for the Rangers. He failed Ranger indoctrination. He was assigned instead to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, and on a routine parachute jump, he came down wrong and fractured 2 bones above his tailbone and wrecked the bones in his shins. Medical discharge, 2004, age 20. So by the summer of 2006, Nathan Nicholson was 22 years old, broken in the back, living in Eugene, taking classes at Lane Community College with a vague plan to become an architect, and visiting his father in prison. And here is the detail that turns this from a sad story into a cold one. His father had been trying to get a message to Moscow since at least 2002. That was the year an inmate walked up to the authorities and said Nicholson was using other prisoners to reach his old handlers. Whatever those attempts were, they went nowhere. 4 years of nothing. From a man with no telephone, no passport, and no visitors he could trust. Except one. By the summer of 2006, Jim Nicholson had run out of every option except his own child. And his own child was the only asset in the world he had spent 22 years developing. In August of 2006, Nathan Nicholson applied for a United States passport. He had never needed one before. And in that visiting room, his father made him an offer. The Russians, Jim explained, still had an account open in his name. He had earned a pension. The service he had worked for owed him money for what he had already done. And there was nothing illegal, he suggested, about a son helping his father collect a debt. Would Nathan serve in his stead on the outside? Nathan said yes. What followed was, according to the federal indictment, an actual training program. In the government's language, it was part of the conspiracy that defendant Harold James Nicholson utilized his CIA training in instructing defendant Nathaniel James Nicholson on how to collect the funds from the Russian Federation in a covert and secret manner. The classroom was a prison visiting room with vending machines and a guard. The curriculum was the same one he had taught at the farm. How to notice if you are being followed. How to talk on a monitored telephone. His trips became business trips. His contacts became insurance sales. Never deposit more than $500 at a time. Pay for travel in cash. Never carry more than $10,000 back into the United States, because $10,000 is the number that forces you to fill out a form. Split the money and hide it in several different places. Give it to your grandparents and your brother and sister. And if anyone asks where it came from, say it's from the family handicraft business. And to get the written material out of a federal prison, he used the oldest technique in the book, a brush pass. Crumpled notes slipped into his son's clothing across a table, in a room with a guard in it. Nathan reportedly worked out a variation of his own, leaving a note buried under a pile of vending machine wrappers for the other one to collect. Prosecutors, writing years later, put the psychology on the record. Nicholson had significant emotional power over his son and used his professional skills to groom and manipulate him. And Nathaniel was excited about the prospect of acting in a clandestine fashion like his father. The first assignment was simple: go to the nearest Russian consulate, which brings us back to the gate in San Francisco in October of 2006, and the 22-year-old with 3 pieces of paper in his hand. Here is what happened. He got inside. He handed over the letter of introduction, the photograph of himself and his father taken in the prison, and the request for money. He explained who he was, and the Russians turned him away. They did not throw him out, and they did not laugh. They told him to come back in 2 weeks, because a young American walking in off the street claiming to be the son of a convicted CIA traitor is either an enormous opportunity or an FBI operation, and Moscow needed a fortnight to work out which. They checked. He was who he said he was. When Nathan came back to that consulate for the second time, an officer handed him $5,000 in $100 bills. Accounts of the case describe it as a token of goodwill from Moscow. A 22-year-old community college student walked out of a Russian diplomatic building in California carrying $50 bills that his father had earned 12 years earlier by selling the names of his own students. And then it escalated, exactly the way his father's own career had escalated, from a consulate to a foreign capital. In December of 2006, Nathan flew to Mexico City and went to the Russian embassy. There, he met a man who, according to the government, was known to the FBI as a former high-ranking KGB officer. His name was Vasily Fedotov. He had reportedly been brought out of retirement for this. Think about the asymmetry in that room. A retired Soviet general on one side of the table. On the other, a kid with a bad back who took the bus to class in Eugene, Oregon, carrying messages his father had crumpled into his pocket. Fedotov gave him $10,000 in $100 bills. Nathan flew home and landed in Portland on the 17th of December 2006, carrying about $10,000 in cash. He divided it up as instructed, some to his grandparents, some to his brother Jeremiah and his sister Star. The family craft business, he told them, had done well. And back in Sheridan, his father did the one thing that guaranteed he would go again. He praised him. According to the prosecutor's sentencing memorandum, Jim Nicholson told his son that he had performed as well as, or better than, some of the CIA employees he had trained for the agency. Sit with that for a second. This is a man who taught the classes of 1994, 1995, and 1996 at the farm. He is telling a 22-year-old with a bad back and no training that he is a better operator than the professionals. It is the cheapest thing he ever gave away, and the most effective. Prosecutors put the result on the record in a single sentence. Nathaniel always took strength from the notion that he was helping the family by following his father's bidding. He wasn't being paid. He was being told he was good at something by the only person whose opinion had ever mattered to him. Now, what was Russia actually buying? Not American secrets. Jim Nicholson had been in a cell since 1996. He had nothing current to sell. According to the indictment and to prosecutors, what the SVR wanted from him was something else entirely. They wanted to know how he had been caught. The identities of the FBI agents who had investigated him in 1996. The timeline of the surveillance. When it started. What triggered it. How much American investigators had learned about Russian intelligence operations in the process of taking him apart. In other words, Moscow was running a post-mortem on its own failure, 12 years late. And the only wire into the source was a prisoner's son. There was one more thing the father wanted, and it is the detail that reframes his tearful explanations later. He passed out his own age, his height, and his weight. The data you need to fill in a Russian visa application. He dropped hints that when he got out, he would like to live in Russia. He was not just collecting a debt. He was arranging an exit. In July of 2007, Nathan went back to Mexico City and came home to Portland on the 12th with about $9,080. By accounts of the case, he was now carrying his father's more ambitious proposals, including, reportedly, a scheme involving a helicopter and ideas about resettlement. In December of 2007, he flew to Lima, Peru. He returned to Portland on the 13th with about $7,013. And with something more valuable than the money, a password phrase, to identify himself at the next meeting. And at Portland International Airport, in what looked like a routine customs inspection, federal agents went through his luggage and found his journal. Names, dates, places, including the arrangements for a meeting in Cyprus. Remember that journal, because by then the net had been closing for a long time, and nobody had told him. The FBI had been listening to the prison telephone, and the code the two of them used was good. Sales, business trips, an insurance deal in San Francisco. But code only works if you never step outside it. At some point, Nathan said a sentence that didn't fit the pattern he'd been taught. "How's that thing going?" Investigators heard a young man reaching for a word and not finding one, and concluded there was something underneath the conversation. After that, a listening device in Nathan's car. Taps on his phone lines. His email read, including, by accounts of the investigation, the technique the SVR had given him, in which he and his handlers left unsent drafts in a shared webmail account so that no message ever traveled anywhere. Even the code phrase for a missed meeting is on the record. My brother Eugene is ill. The FBI had the phone. The FBI had the car. The FBI had the journal with Cyprus written in it, and they let him fly. On the 10th of December 2008, Nathan Nicholson stood outside a TGI Fridays in Nicosia, Cyprus, holding his backpack in his right hand. That was the recognition signal, and waited to be approached by an officer of Russian intelligence. He gave the password phrase from Peru. He passed his father's material. According to the indictment, he was handed $12,000. Then he got on a plane and flew home to Oregon. And on the 14th of December, he walked through Portland International Airport carrying, by his own admission, about $9,500 in cash, just under the line his father had taught him never to cross. On the 15th of December 2008, the FBI took the $9,500. Nathan lied to them. That is in the record too. He sat with federal agents and told them a story. And then he stopped. Prosecutors later said that once he was confronted, he did not hesitate. The 24-year-old, who had spent 2 years believing he was his father's partner, sat in a room with the FBI and gave them everything: the visiting room, the crumpled notes, the vending machine, the consulate, the general in Mexico City, the password, the money split into pieces around Eugene, and he agreed to testify against his father. On the 29th of January 2009, an indictment was unsealed in the District of Oregon charging Harold James Nicholson, 58, of Sheridan, Oregon, and Nathaniel James Nicholson, 24, of Eugene, Oregon, with 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of acting as agents of a foreign government, and 4 counts of money laundering. 7 counts. Between them, on the reported maximums, the 2 of them were looking at something close to 100 years each. The indictment also demanded forfeiture of every dollar the Russian Federation had handed over, on the grounds that all of it was the proceeds of the father's espionage, which is a legal way of saying that the money in Nathan's grandparents' house had been paid for with the names of American case officers. The charged figure that day was $35,593. By the end, when both of them had admitted everything, the total was over $47,000. The acting assistant attorney general for national security, Matthew Olson, described it in one line: an imprisoned spy recruited and trained his own 24-year-old son to travel the globe to collect on past spying debts and channel information to foreign agents. Karen Immergut, the United States Attorney for Oregon, called it a sinister and continuing scheme by a former senior CIA officer turned spy to betray the United States of America for financial gain. And the FBI's Executive Assistant Director for National Security, Arthur Cummings, reduced 14 years to a single clause. Nicholson, already convicted of spying and compromising national security, thought he could profit from his previous espionage despite being behind bars. The FBI's special agent in charge in Oregon, David Ian Miller, was blunter. This is an amazing case. Nicholson, he said, had been allowed to serve his sentence in Oregon to be near his family, and, without regret, he used that proximity to his family to continue contact with the foreign country for which he was previously convicted of spying. Nathan pleaded guilty on the 28th of August 2009. His father held out for over a year and pleaded guilty on the 8th of November 2010. 5 other counts dropped: to conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government and conspiracy to commit international money laundering. On the 7th of December 2010, United States District Judge Anna J. Brown sentenced Nathan Nicholson to 5 years of probation and 100 hours of community service. No prison. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had asked for it jointly, on the shared position that he had been groomed and manipulated by his own father. Once this defendant was confronted, the judge said, he did not hesitate to accept responsibility. Afterward, Nathan spoke to reporters. He said he had idolized his father. Then he said this: "After this, I want to be my own man now. I don't want to live in someone's shadow." and I want to restore the honor that was lost. 6 weeks later, on the 18th of January 2011, the same judge sentenced his father. Jim Nicholson stood up and spoke, and at times he was choked with tears. He said the reason he had done it was desperation, that he was penniless after the first conviction and wanted to help his children with their student loans and their debts. He apologized to his parents. He apologized to his children. And, on the record, in an American federal courtroom, he apologized to his Russian contacts. Then he talked about Nathan. "I love him dearly. I could not be more proud of him," he said. "He has never let me down, and he has never failed his family." Across the courtroom, Nathan teared up and put his head against a family member's shoulder. Judge Brown listened to all of it, called the statement eloquent, and then said the sentence that closes this case better than any verdict. Notably absent from his remarks was any suggestion of remorse. She gave him 96 months, 8 years, to run consecutively on top of the 283 months he was already serving. She noted that he could have walked out in June of 2017 at the age of 66. Instead, he would be inside, and probably in solitary confinement, until at least 2025. As part of the deal, Jim Nicholson was allowed 10 minutes of relative privacy with his family. He was forbidden to touch them. United States Marshals stood in the room and listened. It was the first time in American history that a convicted spy was convicted of new crimes involving the same foreign country he had spied for, while still serving the sentence for the original espionage. Outside the courthouse, the FBI's special agent in charge in Oregon, Arthur Balazan, separated the two halves of it in a way nobody in the Justice Department improved on afterward. At a global level, he said, the case showed that international espionage was still a threat to America decades after the Cold War ended. And then, on a personal level, it shows the damage a father can do as he manipulates a son into a world of dishonor. The United States Attorney for Oregon, Dwight Holton, put it shorter. Nicholson betrayed his country, and he betrayed his family, and stooped so low as to involve his son. Nathan Nicholson served his probation and went to Oregon State University to study computer science, living on VA benefits and financial aid, in what he called a very frugal way. Lori Cooper, accused by her own husband of spying for the Romanians, never got a public apology. John McGuire, the Baltimore cop who became a traitor's deputy, was never publicly decorated for it. Vasily Fedotov, who handed a student $10,000 in a Mexican embassy, was never charged. The $9,500 from Cyprus was forfeited to the United States. And the CIA case officers of the classes of 1994, 1995, and 1996 kept the ceiling their instructor built for them. Harold James Nicholson was moved from Sheridan to the federal supermax at Florence, Colorado, the concrete box that has held Robert Hansen and El Chapo, and he walked out of it in late November 2023, a few days after his 73rd birthday, having served about 27 years. Before that release, John McGuire, the man who had once carried his files and stolen his coffee cup, was asked what Nicholson would do now, and gave a 4-word forecast. He'll be gone in a couple of weeks. He had already recruited an American once. He'd already recruited his own son. The only person left to sell was himself.